The bear that should never have been there. September 19th, 2024. A remote corner of Iceland's Westfjords. There are no polar bears here. At least, there aren't supposed to be. Inside a small summer house, an elderly woman suddenly hears something outside. Not footsteps. Something heavier. Something dragging through her garbage. She looks outside and sees a polar bear. A massive white predator is standing just outside her home. The woman locks herself upstairs. There is no normal cell service. So she contacts her daughter in Reykjavik through a satellite connection and waits for help. Hours later, police arrive. The bear is still there. It is close to the house. Close enough that the situation has become dangerous. Then a decision is made. The bear is shot. It is over almost as quickly as it began. But here's what makes this story disturbing. This wasn't simply a panic decision made by a few officers. Iceland had already spent years deciding what to do when this exact situation happened. And the answer was brutally simple. If a polar bear reaches Iceland and becomes a threat, it is usually killed. The animal that had crossed the ocean had no way of knowing that. It had no idea it had reached the wrong country. And it certainly couldn't know that, on this island, there was almost no realistic path back home. So why does Iceland treat a polar bear differently from almost anywhere else? And what happened in 2008 that changed the country's policy forever? Because the answer isn't simply that polar bears are dangerous. The real story is much stranger. Iceland has no polar bears. To understand what happens when a polar bear reaches Iceland, you first have to understand something unusual about Iceland itself. Polar bears do not belong there. They are not an Icelandic species. They do not maintain a population on the island. They do not hunt there year-round, and they cannot reproduce there successfully. The Icelandic Institute of Natural History says more than 600 polar bears have been recorded arriving in Iceland since human settlement began. But these are not animals migrating into a new home. They are vagrants. Animals that somehow ended up in the wrong place. And the geography explains how. Across the Denmark Strait, roughly 180 miles away, lies Greenland. Greenland is home to polar bears. Iceland is not. Between the two is a huge stretch of cold ocean. And sometimes, a polar bear gets caught in the middle. The animal may be traveling on sea ice. The ice breaks apart. Currents begin carrying it south. The bear keeps moving. Until eventually, the ice disappears. And the bear is left in open water. That is when a journey that began as a normal movement across Arctic habitat can become a desperate swim toward land. And if the bear survives that journey, it can eventually see something it was never supposed to see. Iceland. The worst place to arrive. Imagine being a polar bear. You have spent your life around sea ice. Your world is white. Frozen. Open. And beneath that ice is the food you depend on. Then suddenly, there is no ice. No familiar hunting ground. No seal breathing holes. No Arctic landscape. Only water. And eventually, a dark coastline appears. You climb onto land. You are exhausted. You are hungry. And you have entered a country where almost nobody has experience dealing with you. This is one of the biggest problems. Iceland has no established wild population of large predators comparable to polar bears. Its only native land mammal is the Arctic fox. So there is no permanent polar bear infrastructure. No network of specialized teams stationed around the island. No normal system for safely capturing and relocating a wandering bear. And that matters because a polar bear isn't an animal you can simply chase away. It is one of the largest land predators on Earth. A starving bear near a farm is not just a wildlife sighting. It is a potential emergency. And Iceland learned that lesson the hard way. 2 bears changed everything. 2008. 2 polar bears reached Iceland. 2 animals. Within the same year. And suddenly, the country had a problem it couldn't ignore. The first bear was killed. But the second created something much more complicated. Authorities tried to find a way to save it. The idea sounded simple. Sedate the bear. Capture it. Transport it. Get it back toward Greenland. A perfect ending. The endangered animal survives. The public gets its happy story. And Iceland avoids killing a creature that never intended to be there. But wildlife rescue isn't a movie. You cannot simply walk up to a 300 or 400-pound polar bear and give it an injection. The animal has to be immobilized safely. The dose has to work. The bear has to be controlled. And then comes the biggest problem. What do you do with it? Because once you have a sedated polar bear, you still have a sedated polar bear. And transporting one across hundreds of kilometers of harsh Arctic territory is an enormous logistical operation. The rescue effort eventually failed, and the bear was killed. 2 bears. 2 deaths. And Iceland was left with a question nobody could avoid anymore. What should happen the next time? Iceland did the math. After the 2008 incidents, Iceland's environment minister created a task force to examine the problem. Scientists, wildlife authorities, police, conservation officials, veterinary authorities, people whose job was to answer one question. What is the safest and most responsible way to deal with a polar bear that reaches Iceland? The answer was controversial, but it was clear. The task force concluded that killing vagrant polar bears was the most appropriate response. Not because the bears were considered worthless, not because Iceland wanted to kill them, and not because the species wasn't protected. In fact, Iceland protects polar bears. But there is an important exception. If one poses a threat to people or livestock, lethal action can be permitted. The task force gave 3 major reasons. The first was human safety. The second was the condition of the East Greenland polar bear population. And the third was cost. And that third reason is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because saving one bear can require an entire emergency operation, specialized equipment, specialists, transportation, aircraft, veterinary support, and somewhere to take the animal, all for a species that has no viable long-term habitat in Iceland. The conclusion was harsh. Iceland could not justify building a permanent system to rescue an animal that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. But there was another argument. And this one was even more important. The bear is not home. A polar bear reaching Iceland has not discovered a new paradise. It has reached a place where it cannot survive normally. There isn't enough suitable sea ice. There isn't an established food base comparable to its Greenland habitat. And females cannot successfully establish a breeding population there. The Icelandic Institute of Natural History explicitly states that polar bears cannot thrive in Iceland over the long term because of the lack of sea ice and limited food supply. So even if authorities somehow captured the animal alive, they still had to answer the next question. Where does it go? You can't release it into Iceland. You can't simply put it on another beach. And sending it back to Greenland isn't a routine wildlife relocation. The bear could be injured. The people handling it could be injured. And the entire operation could become dangerous. So the authorities made a calculation. The bear came from East Greenland. That population could withstand the loss of an occasional individual. Iceland couldn't provide the habitat. And attempting to relocate the animal could create serious safety and financial problems. The equation was brutal. But to the task force, it made sense. Then the bears stopped coming. After 2008, the story became quieter. Another bear appeared in 2010, another in 2011, then one in 2016. And each time, the same basic question returned. Can this animal be saved? Or does the risk make that impossible? The answer remained largely unchanged. Then came something strange. Silence. Years passed. No confirmed polar bear. 5 years. 6. 7. The memory of the last incident faded. Until September 2024.